The Beatles' I Me Mine, composed by George Harrison, takes on an introspective exploration of the self, the ego, the id, to a commanding waltzing cadence. During the period just before the breakup, the Let It Be album was a strange, dark time in Beatles history, leaving George Harrison indifferent whether I Me Mine would even be considered for inclusion on the record. Every Beatles member at this point had been stretching their wings with solo work, different bands, you name it, and this was one of the few songs that brought them back together, minus John Lennon, just for a moment before they went their separate ways. It's dark, it's honest, it's one of the more underrated masterworks of the Beatles. Today we'll be showing you 10 very interesting facts about the Beatles. George Harrison is becoming a composing juggernaut, writing song after song, hit after hit, although many will be thwarted from Let It Be, so he'll end up putting them on his first solo album, All Things Must Pass. Paul McCartney, never been better, equally writing a staggering amount of songs, all lying in wait to be recorded and polished, either for Let It Be or for his solo album. Ringo Starr, of course not often a composing force for the Beatles, is still present for session after session, always the reliable backbone of the group. And John Lennon is preoccupied with his new relationship to Yoko Ono and addicted to heroin. One could say the Beatles are going through some things. Despite this unstoppable magical mystery tour bus towards certain destruction, George Harrison is he himself unstoppable, composing not only I Me Mine and For You Blue, which he managed to convince the band were worthy of inclusion on the Let It Be album, but also Old Brown Shoe and Something, and the titular All Things Must Pass, and many more songs for that album. George was on fire. George wrote I Me Mine on January 7, 1969, at his house in Esher. The Beatles had only just begun rehearsals at Twickenham Studios for the Let It Be project just a few days before, to give you an idea of the time frame. While in search for new music, George believed he had a good offering, but as you'll see, he was turning more and more into his own person, as opposed to just another Beatle, and his flippant sort of disregard for if the rest of the band was into his song is quite evident in this next quote. George says when playing it for the Let It Be film director. I Me Mine, it's called. Should I sing it to you? I don't. I don't care if you don't want it. I don't give a shit about it. I don't give a if it's going into the musical. Side note, he says musical because before they had decided on the rooftop concert, they had actually considered doing a sort of musical with their songs instead. George continues, to me they're just songs, and I just write them, and some will be considered as good by maybe the masses, and some won't. But to me, they're just songs, things that are there that have to be got out. What I love about this song is that although it's obviously quite serious and emotional, the language isn't too flowery. It's very direct and clear what George is talking about, and the concept of philosophical self comes through brilliantly. After songs like The Inner Light and Within You, Without You, George was no stranger to the self, his self, and I Me Mine is no exception. It must be noted that whilst partaking in certain hallucinogenics, the occurrence of ego death will happen. Difficult to explain if you haven't experienced it, but conceptually, it is the derealization of the you, the me. Disregarding the other sensory disturbances, it truly is the disappearance of oneself. Some say this can be also discovered in transcendental meditation, but obviously acid doesn't take the same kind of practice, George says. I suppose having LSD was like someone catapulting me into space. The LSD experience was the biggest experience that I had up until that time. After one dose of acid, I felt like I was stuck in this thing, which later I realized is called relativity. So the big I I'm talking about is the absolute, whereas we are in the relative where everything is good, bad, yes, no, up, down, black, white. That's why they called it the heaven and hell drug. But life is heaven and hell. We see it as or make it into hell or heaven. There's no heaven or hell beyond relativity. So suddenly I looked around and everything I could see was relative to my ego. Like, that's my piece of paper, and that's my flannel, or give it to me, or I am. It drove me crackers. I hated everything about my ego. It was a flash of everything false and impermanent, which I disliked. But later I learned from it, to realize that there is somebody else in here apart from the old blabbermouth. That's what I felt. I hadn't seen or heard or done anything in my life, and yet I hadn't stopped talking. Who am I? Became the order of the day. Anyway, that's what came out of it. I Me Mine. The truth within us has to be realized. When you realize that everything else that you see and do and touch and smell isn't real, then you may know what reality is and can answer the question, who am I? These concepts, although having been discussed all over the world, independent of each other, Aristotle, Plato, philosophers all over the world in Africa, China, Europe, the Americas, humans have been universally looking inwards, regardless of country. It just so happens that George had found significant interest in India and Eastern philosophy. Just like anything you discover you love, you have to just gobble it up, don't you? I know a lot of you binge the absolute devil out of these videos. That's what we do to things we love. It's totally natural. Well, George would read every Eastern book he could get his hands on. One of the more famous ones is the Bhagavad Gita. If you don't know what that is, real quick, it's a really short epic about a war over a kingdom. And before the war starts, the lead character, Arjuna, discusses with his advisor, Krishna, who is considered a god, about a whole bunch of stuff. It's awesome. If you like mythology, don't sleep on this one. So obviously George had read this book, and it also discussed the concept of the I, me, mine, as it reads, "They are forever free who renounce all selfish desires and break away from the ego cage of I, me, mine, to be united with the Lord. This is the supreme state. Attain to this and pass from death to immortality." That's just a passage of one book, but this concept is everywhere, as George recalls saying, "I kept coming across the words I, me, mine in books about yoga and stuff. And about the meaning of life and the difference between the ego and the soul, the real you and the you that people mistake their identity to be. This bag of flesh and bones and the ego, and that's really it. I, me, and mine. It's all ego orientation. It's something that is used all the time." That rhythm you hear is a waltz in 6/8, and it was actually inspired by what George had been watching on television. A science fiction show called Europa. In the background of the show, which George found to be terribly abysmal, he hears a bit of music he falls in love with. The piece was from composer Johann Strauss, Kaiser Walzer, and it goes like this. Instead of the more rock and roll break in the song, George initially wanted to have a flamenco style shift, as you can hear here.
To the day I need
However, this was met with John's distaste for the idea, who, to be completely honest, didn't show a tremendous amount of interest in George's song. So when George shows John that bit, John retorts, "We're a rock and roll band, you know." Which is true, but they did have a lot of songs in their catalog that were not purely rock, a lot of them being Paul's, and John did say those were granny shit, so maybe he just felt more comfortable scolding George back then. I'm not too sure on what the motivation could be. Let me know in the comments what you think. Paul suggested keeping the flamenco bit, but saying, that sounds like it would be a good rock bit. It gets out of the idea of the waltz. So they wrote a 12-bar blues segment right there with the lyrical harmony we hear on it, I, me, mine. This is a great fact. George was unsure of the grammatical correctness of the lyrics, flowing more freely than wine. So he asked Paul, is that grammatical? Flowing more freely than wine? Flowing more freer? Is there such a word as freer? Is it free-ear? To which the Let It Be director, Mr. Lindsay Hogg, suggested frere. And Paul chimes in, it's like queer. It turns out freely was the right choice. This fact will most likely irritate you, because well, some of the behavior John Lennon exhibits here is not super nice to George. However, I think the real takeaway is how coolly George handled it and moved with it. It really shows that he was rather secure with himself. So George had already shown Paul and Ringo I, Me, Mine, but not John. George asks John if he would like to learn a new song. John gets the general vibe of it, but doesn't take it seriously and spends some of the rehearsal time just joking around, still admonishing George for the flamenco though. So after they all convene to get to it, John asks, are you going to teach us this? So George does, again, and then John once more loses interest and begins to dance the waltz with Yoko, while Ringo, Paul, and George continue to work. George, being the not rude one, doesn't flip out or anything and actually begins to smile at the impromptu dance routine, and suggests that maybe John's sole contribution to the song should just be to dance while they played it for the upcoming musical, since, as George says, it wasn't completely necessary for John to be on it instrumentally. George asked John, do you want to do that on the show? That'd be great, because it's so simple to do, that tune. but to do that waltz or something if you want to bag it up a bit. Finally, John is interested in I Me Mine because he gets to dance, and the rest of the band actually rehearsed and practiced George Harrison's song better than most of the Let It Be sessions. Oh my god, I'm so hungry. That was really loud. So George is the youngest Beatle, written less songs than Paul and John, and it's still a band, so Paul decides to give George some critiques to help him in his eyes. Hey, it's better than what John was contributing. So Paul says to George about that 12-bar blue progression that maybe it should not be I, me, mine, but instead he says, my is good to sing. It's like ma, I is not. As easy to do. It's like night. It's easy to sing. Right, that's ma. It's easy. It's like my. It's easy to shout. George puts his foot down and insists it remains I, me, mine, which makes sense because as we established before, the lyrics were integral to George's meaning and where the song was inspired from. It's one thing to tweak some lyrics, but these ones seem integral to George getting his message across, instead of cheapening it by changing the words to something arbitrary in the hopes that it rolled off the tongue better. George tells Paul that Paul can sing whatever he wants, but as the composer, this is what George wants and should get. It's obvious John Lennon really was tuning out for not just this song, but the Beatles in general. This was about the time he was mentioning it was time for him to get a divorce from the Beatles. Sucks though, because even though the dancing was okay, I guess, it ended up being a pretty great rocker, and I think we all would have liked to see what John could have brought to the table. But it is what it is. But in his absence, Paul, Ringo, and George got along smashingly, and it really shows if you listen to some of the Anthology 3 releases and takes. It was a nice moment of camaraderie when, as we know, they were about to be done with each other. Kind of harkens back to those three getting back together all those years later to finish John's song, huh? But George really did take it in stride, didn't he? I feel I learned a lot from his behavior because I know many of us would not like to be disrespected in that way and may have made a mess of it by getting upset. But George kind of let go of his ego, let John have his fun, and allowed himself and his song to not take it all so seriously. He really embodied many of the things he was talking about, didn't he? Before we go, I'm working on a new single entitled Long Gone Days. It's currently being mastered. I have an idea for a music video that I think would be really beautiful, and it's something you can be a part of. The concept of the song is about reminiscing about the old days in our lives, the people we've loved, the people we've lost, and everything in between. My idea for the music video is just pictures of all of you with someone or just of that someone that you love. Your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, parents, grandparents, anyone you love really, and a little blurb written to or about them. It's like a time capsule where those people and that beautiful love can be immortalized in a music video. Strangers everywhere joining together to do something lovely. It's such an unpleasant time. I think we could all use that. So email that picture and blurb to this email here. Whether there's 200 submissions or 200,000, I'll put it all in there. Okay, everyone, thanks for watching. I can't wait to see you next week. Goodbye.